So we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the Enlightenment here in section 2. The first section we talked about the scientific revolution, and now we are actually going to move forward to all of the actual thinkers. And it's called the Enlightenment, but really it's the Enlightenments in like plural fashion. And so we're going to, we looked at the scientific revolution in the first lecture. If you haven't watched that, that's kind of on you. I told you that it was posted. But yeah, and all of this is going to culminate in the French Revolution. Pretty optimistic, and it's really an optimistic time period for mankind because it's really going to open up our ability to kind of reason and think, and that's really what the focus of the Enlightenment is this ability to think. Now, it's often critical of traditional religion and traditions within society, kind of like the scientific revolution was. And if you've watched that lecture, then you kind of understand what I'm talking about in that the scientific revolution came as a result of monotheism, in a way. Because once there's no longer the cop-out of, oh, well, the sun god pulls the sun across the sky every day because there's just one God. And, now we need to figure out, like, why does the sun go around us then? At the time they think the sun goes around us. And so then they start having these scientific discoveries. And through those scientific discoveries, you end up with agnosticism and deism, which actually drives people away from religion. But it all started because of monotheistic religion. Watch the first lecture. So, yeah, that's what I said to do yesterday. The Enlightenment thinkers have seen the results of the scientific method and the combination of deductive and inductive reasoning and human reasoning in general. And the results of those apply to the universe and to the world. And so now we're going to say, how can we apply this to society as well? And then they're going to say, well, we need to return to and overturn some of these traditional power structures like absolute monarchs. They say man is naturally good. They're very optimistic about human reasoning. And during one of the readings in here, you're going to see is the inability to use one's understanding of how how to guide yourself, and it's self-imposed. And when it's when you have imposed this restriction on yourself of immaturity, it leads us to a lack of understanding and a lack of courage to use our minds, and then relying on other people just to tell us what to do instead of thinking for ourselves. And that's one of the major things coming out of the Enlightenment is this idea that you should think for yourself, right? And hopefully every one of you are going to go on and get a really good, solid college education. But understand that those college professors are going to have their own ideas and their own leanings, and that you should always continue to think for yourself, because if you simply rely on what they tell you, what happens if they're lying? Have you thought about that, right? Even when I'm teaching you, how do you know I'm not lying? Now, most of the time you can reason. Well, Coach Redmond, I know that this is your job and that you care a lot about it. You put a lot of time into making sure that you are able to discuss these things with us. We know that it means a lot to you. We also know that it's, if people just found out you were straight line, you might lose your job, not be able to take care of your family. So there's incentive for you. And also, I can go and kind of look up some of this stuff independently. Now, whether you do that or not is on you. But you can find some reasoning behind the fact that maybe I'm not lying to you just straight up, or at least not on purpose, right? That I'm not lying to you just to push my agenda as much as I might be lying because I just maybe misunderstood something myself, right? Which is still technically a lie, but not really. Now, our politicians and pundits on the media and in the government, they lie about, all the time. And you kind of have to use your own mind to unpack and go through some of what you're told through the media and the stories you see on Snapchat or whatever, or TikTok or whatever you get your news from, to figure out, well, is this true or not? So the Enlightenment really focuses on that. Now, The blueprints of the Enlightenment are really going to challenge that old regime that we talked about in the previous modules and lectures. The absolutists and the monarchs that say they derive their rule from divine authority, right? And this is going to challenge that old way of thinking based on, that's based on the hierarchy and inequality. And you have these kings and popes, and they're all in this completely separate, untouchable power structure. And the Enlightenment thinkers are going to say, hey, maybe there's a better way to do that. Maybe there's a more reasonable way that humans can take care of themselves. And they're going to challenge those ideas by using human reasoning and saying, hey, society can make itself better and benefit through what we see in science and applying these principles of the scientific method to reason and society. And there's something else that we're going to analyze, and that's the significance of the middle class. There's a growing middle class during the 17th century and into the 18th century as well. And support for the middle class is really going to bolster the Enlightenment thinkers, okay? And that's going to be one of the best ways that they end up actually overthrowing some of the old power structures is with a rise of an educated middle class who can think for themselves and actually understand these scientific principles and start to reason a little bit because they've become more educated. And that's going to be a huge part of this. And it really is going to give a rebirth to the ideas of democracy and self-rule.
Can that also be said because of the increase of the capitalist movement, just because the middle class?
We're not quite there yet.
Okay.
We don't quite have an emergence of consumerism. We're not to the industrializing of things yet, so we don't have mass production yet. That's going to be about another, 100 years.
But those middle class people started to create their own business, right? Or is that?
Well, the middle class really comes from more of an increase in agricultural technology, that we have a surplus of food and people are going to be able to have more leisure time. Remember, even coming out of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, you had an influx of wealth and leisure time, and now you're really starting to see the products of that.
Okay. So because they have more time to do other stuff, because of the advancement of agricultural tools, they can be educated therefore.
Right, and then they're going to want to think more, deductively. Now, these notions of progress are pretty elusive. The Enlightenment really is also really introducing a new world of uncertainties, and you can just upset the old hierarchy and immediately get everything right with a new one is just not true. These things take time, so we have to question whether it's really progress. Is being anti-religious actually progress, or is it misunderstanding religion by saying, the Catholic Church is too powerful, and all of these things? Therefore, we want to get rid of the old hierarchy and get rid of the churches. Is that actually progress or not? Or is it just an overreaction and trying to go in a different direction? And I think that there's a fine line that takes place between there. And there are some really dangerous ideas that take place in the discord between these thinkers. It's really easy to create an anarchy if you're not careful, if you don't really go through and think this stuff all the way through. So Enlightenment thinkers are actually going to recognize this as well. And we'll get back to some of their individual ideas, but they're very troubled about, they're really troubled about, the power structure. Now, some of the ideas that they have are really dangerous, even today. They kind of start this idea of, truth and morality being relative. And, I think that we all can categorically reject that morality is a relative term. It's the idea of postmodernism that is really taking off in today's society. The idea that, nothing means anything. Words are just words, and we define their meaning, so we can redefine their meaning if we want to. So saying a boy is something is false, and saying a girl means something is false. A girl or boy is just whatever you think it means, so nothing means anything, and anything can mean nothing, and everything means everything, and we should just accept that, including what is right and what's wrong, and that's bunk. That is absolute garbage. We believe in absolute truth and absolute right and wrong as believers in the faith, and that's important to understand. So there are some kind of interesting things, but it's not all relative, but there are a lot of issues that are difficult to determine. There are certain things that are absolutely morally bankrupt, like the Holocaust, right? Like, I don't think there's any way that you could be like, oh yeah, that was good for the world. But there's people that have tried. Legitimate academics have tried to say, oh, well, it really helped not have such a big Earth population. It's like, okay, you're evil, so there you go. And so, we're going to talk about several of these guys, and so we don't memorialize wrong things, and we can't just erase history. We have to learn from it, and it takes a lot more nuance than a lot of people are really willing to work on and think about. And you have Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, and really the first real Enlightenment figure in England is Thomas Hobbes. Probably he caused a pretty big controversy when he writes his book called The Leviathan. And he took a sociological perspective, basically, and felt that, by nature, people are self-serving and that we're preoccupied with gathering and, this limited number of resources for ourselves. And, Hobbes would basically continue to essentially say, have a single intimidating rule that, there should be one person in charge to keep all you other jerks in line because you're all going to just be self-servant. And if there's not one central power, then then everybody's just going to devolve into anarchy and nobody's going to take care of each other, which is kind of a really pessimistic way of looking at humans. But it was also a really important way to justify absolutism. Oh, so the kings are like, hey, I need somebody to come up with a sociological reason why I should be an absolutist. We can't get away with the divine rights of kings, and Hobbes comes along and he's like, well, if you weren't in charge, it would be anarchy because regular people are just too selfish and stupid, and you're not because you're the king, so you should be in charge. And all the kings were like, yeah, we like Thomas Hobbes. Good job, buddy. But then when John Locke comes along and he promotes the opposite type of government, which is a representative government, in what he calls his two treatises of government, Hobbes is more influential among his contemporaries, but it's clear that Locke's message was closer to the people's hearts and minds. Just before this, the Protestants had helped overthrow James II and install William and Mary. And we talked about, the new Bill of Rights. And Locke basically goes along with this and believes that human individuality is founded on individual consciousness, that we are individuals. We are not one big amalgamation of people and mass of people that all move in the same direction, that we all have our own ideas, and that the only way to make sure that the government serves everybody is to have everybody represented in that government. That one person can't just speak for everybody because we don't all believe the same things. And that was kind of what Locke was talking about. That we should have, an empathetic representative democracy where everybody has a say. And so those are definitely going to be some of the roots that we see take hold and form the American Revolution later on. In France, where the Enlightenment really takes off, you have some scholars known as the philosophers. Anyways, they're the philosophers. They're committed to reform, much like a lot of things we introduced already. They're celebrating science, applying it to society, but they're also battling censorship. Now, of course, the rulers are not very keen on some of these new ideas. And they're saying, basically like, what Newton is doing in science and what they're trying to take that and apply it to society, we don't like it. And you actually have here's a picture of a stamp from the time period. It celebrates Newton's work and stuff like that. And so they're battling censorship, which means they have to have a kind of a safe refuge. These thinkers are going to need safe refuge. And so it's, these philosophers really find a community together. They kind of work behind the scenes because obviously monarchs are not going to want you to say that we should have a representative government and no monarchs. So they're going to try and really make these people not talk and not be able to print their stuff and not be able to share their ideas. But actually they end up being protected in salons. That tends to be where you could go into a beauty salon and run into some of the greatest thinkers of all time during the 1700s in France. It was kind of crazy. Like, that's where they would go and, like, talk shop, I guess, you know. Huh? Yeah. So we're going to kind of begin here with Diderot's Encyclopedia, which is written from 1751 to 1772, and it's an extremely ambitious thing. Imagine trying to say, hey, my project is going to attempt to illustrate all human knowledge into a single book for the first time ever. Like, okay, buddy, good luck with that. And so, you know, Diderot is going to bring together lots and lots of experts, and the culmination of these French philosophers and their strength of numbers and dedication and organization comes through with this encyclopedia. And a lot of this actually happens at, a salon. And the encyclopedia and his fellows, they changed the general way of thinking. They believe that greater knowledge will actually lead to human progress. They emphasize moderation and tolerance. They believe that human nature can be molded and that people have inalienable rights, and there exists something called a social contract. And basically the idea that the ruler is only ruling because the people allow him to, right? And that the people are the law, and that the people have, that justice has to serve the people, and that there's an unspoken contract between a ruler and the people who are ruled, and that person only continues to be the ruler if the people say that they do. And they are also very optimistic. They believe that, you know, knowledge could improve the goodness of the soul, and that people are not inherently wicked, but you know, that they're going to continue to do bad things, but we're not wicked people. Okay. Then the American Enlightenment is when these ideas are going to kind of load up on a boat, set sail, and head to America. And you know, the whole American Revolution, which is really the next module, there's no consensus on the exact time span here of when these ideas really start to show up. But we know that they came with the British people to the North American colonies. And of course, early United States, once the revolution is successful, it becomes very clear that it was very inspired by these thinkers from Britain and France. And it's going to kind of shift allegiances from, you know, whether it's religious or political allegiances to different places in Europe. You know, the French thinkers and away from the British, and we're going to think and kind of think more about the way the French are doing things and stuff like that. And it's going to be really interesting how the founders of our country are influenced by Locke and Hobbes and Voltaire and some of these other French guys that we're going to talk about here in a second. Our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Ben Franklin, Thomas Paine, Hamilton. These are all very famous people in the American system that embrace deism and liberalism and republicanism and conservatism, toleration and scientific progress. And these are all things coming out of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And it's then going to further shape our budding nation by installing anti-authoritarian doctrines and some of these things that you can clearly see in our Constitution and our founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, you know, unalienable rights and stuff like this. But you also have people like Thomas Jefferson pushing for the idea of separation of church of state, because Thomas Jefferson was a deist, as we talked about at the end of last lecture, right? That you should have watched. That basically he said, hey, God started all this, but it was like he wound a clock up, took the key out, moved the pendulum, and just took his hands off and said, I'm never interfering again. That's what Thomas Jefferson believed. And he actually took his Bible, he had somebody print him a Bible with no miracles in it, because he wanted to believe that God did not interfere with human existence, therefore miracles can't happen. And so he believed in God, but not really. He made himself a Gillette Bible.
So he was just like, he just believed creation and that was it.
Yeah, he believed a Gillette Bible. You know Gillette razors?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he shaved out the parts he didn't like. Yeah. You can use that. Now we're going to talk about four major different thinkers of the Enlightenment and show you some of their specific points. And some of it's going to be strange, but it's really important. Some of them have, expressed an idea that is basically contradicting to the overview that I gave you. But that's kind of the danger of a survey class, that we're going to hit all of it and realize that in total the Enlightenment had this overarching theme, although not everybody that was involved in the Enlightenment followed that arch. Does that make sense? And so we're going to do long sweeps of this from 30,000 feet. So we're going to look here at Voltaire. And I want you to know that he is very much a critic of society. He is very sassy. He sparks little in the way of change, but he's very good at exposing problems. And he wants to expose injustices and appeal to a wide range of readers. He's kind of funny in his satire as well, and one of your readings this week is from Voltaire. It is incredibly potent, and you could basically say that it directly could be applied to what is happening in our society today if you really look at it and think about what it's talking about. And maybe we can do that after we take our quiz on that. We'll look at Voltaire's reading. He shows that there's this eternal battle between reason and regression. And there's never been a stronger, rallying cry than Voltaire and his writing. He thinks, hey, he was big on free speech, and he wants to reform society. He wants to get rid of superstition, and he also has a very interesting view of God and the church, and he doesn't like the church. In fact, he actually wants to kind of stamp out some of the corruption that's happening there. And he wants to get rid of fanatical regicides, and he's actually an admirer of Louis XIV. And it's kind of interesting. Like, he's kind of a contradiction in a lot of ways, but he also believed in, that there shouldn't be an allegiance between the church and state. That's where the idea of separation of church and state came from, was Voltaire. And it wasn't because he didn't believe that, religion was an important part of life or that it was important in morality. He just believed, he's looking at the church at the time and going, hey, look what happens when we allow the Catholic Church to have too much say in politics. It'd be easier if they were completely separated. And so he says, hey, corruption's bad. He's a big proponent of free speech in the most extreme way. And it's kind of interesting when you look at some of his writings. The next guy is David Hume, and to be honest, not my favorite here. He really is kind of a weird kind of person in this. And a lot of his initial work, I think, is just wrong. And he actually... there's some thoughts that he may have actually retracted a lot of it by the time he gets to the end of his life and said, hey, this isn't true. I shouldn't have wrote this. But what he's famous for, he said that the human mind is nothing but a bundle of impressions, and that at the end of the day, we can only learn through experience, right? That we actually don't know anything at all, and everything that we are is just an impression of what we have seen. That we are nothing in and of ourselves. That we are 100% just a product of the environment we came up in, which basically takes away, individualism. He's basically saying there is no individualism. You are you're a reflection of your experience of society as you got older, which is to some extent, but it also takes away the ability of you to have free will, if you really think about it. Basically, everything you do and say is not because that's what you truly think or believe, it's because that's what you've seen done and said before.
Is that conglomeration of ideas not unique?
Yeah, but it's not all of who you are.
No.
You know what I'm saying? No, he was partly right, but he's saying there's nothing else. There is just what you experienced, and that's who you are, period.
Right. But yes,
What else would it be? What it would be?
The ability to have free will and make your own choices. That'd be like saying that if you grew up around violence all the time, that you inevitably have to be violent. You can't make the choice not to be.
he's onto something, but he's not.
Correct. Right. And so I think it's very interesting, that that, he basically said you can't trust your own reasoning. That if you reason through something, don't trust that because that's not really your reasoning. You're just using other people's reasoning. Don't question things because if you question it, you're just going to get what other people want you to think.
He's pretty superstitious.
He's kind of taking the idea away from you being able to think for yourself. That there is no self, essentially, which I think is not true. I think that we are made with a soul and we are able to have free will and that we are able to decide and reason what is right and wrong. And if we see people just doing wrong all the time, that doesn't mean that we have to make that choice, right? That we get to choose who we are.
So how's he an enlightened thinker? Is he just because he thought of something different?
Yeah, I mean, and it's just, it really got people to start asking questions and talking about what does it mean for our existence in the universe then? What is God's purpose for our life? Like, why are we here? And it kind of opens up the big series of questions.
So he didn't really fit in with the theme, but he just opened a can of worms.
Yeah. He's very skeptical of his contemporaries, and again,
So really anybody could be an enlightenment thinker. So these dudes are just dudes that thought.
yeah.
They're like tripping one day. They're like, yo, what if?
Yeah, pretty much. Then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's actually our most radical thinker. He went as far to say in a couple different works on a social contract that the civilization destroys the individual, that civilization actually destroys you as an individual, that man is by nature solitary and we want to be left alone and live an individual life, and that we are better when we are free, and that when we are in society, we get caught up in all these different things of corruption, and it corrupts all the goodness within us, that society is bad and individuals are inherently good, but only if we exist by ourselves, which is, yeah, to some extent, basically, that, and that man is, that good and free and all of this stuff, that having to obey, like having to rely on power structures and obey laws actually destroys your individualism, which, again,
Part of it's right.
partly true, that
Individuals are inherently good. That's
the question is, are we inherently good or not? Like, does a lack of laws make us better or does it make us worse? I would argue that anarchy, no government actually allows human beings to exhibit the worst parts of themselves, unless you consider that human nature, which is sinful, is not a bad thing, then,
without laws, how would you know what's right or wrong?
right, that's what I'm
So
saying.
it's like,
Exactly.
we have morality, but then
Basically, he's saying civilization is actually a decaying of human existence, not progress of human existence, which is interesting. It's it's thought-provoking, I mean, to some extent. He wrote a book that's kind of half novel, half philosophy called Emile, and about how you should educate a young person. And basic philosophy of education is that you should basically cultivate our natural tendencies. He even provides a girlfriend for Emile to explore his sexuality as part of his education. I mean, these are really radical and extreme ideas. So he's saying, hey, just leave him alone. Like, you've got this young boy and just throw a girl in there and see what he does to her and just let him kind of just go with that, really kind of strange ideas. That, telling him something is good or bad is really a deterioration of his human nature, and that human nature is really good. So you should just let people just be good. This is going to get him in trouble with the people in Paris to a certain extent. It really gets him in trouble with what he says about religion and the role of faith in a person's life. And it actually gets him kicked out of Paris because he totally rejects religion. He said that religion is basically like civilization, that it is a power structure that humans have imposed upon themselves in order to control their own urges and natural tendencies, and that it restricts our ability to really progress as a race. The dude just equal and opposite reaction.
it's like, what does he define as like progress?
Exactly.
Clearly not.
He thinks that civilization corrupts and that religion corrupts, and that a civilized man is an alienated man. Now, I think this is one of the great books of all time, even though I disagree. like with most of his ideas, it is really interesting to read because it makes you kind of think about all these presuppositions about like what you think and how that, how do you disagree or agree with it? I mean, I think it's important to read things you disagree with so that you understand why you disagree with them, right? You don't know that you disagree with something until you expose yourself to it, and then you go, hey, I actually do disagree with this because I believe this, right? So it's really important. And so, it's worth looking at some of that. But he does reject society as a whole, and, it's really important to kind of think about what that means in terms of social relationships and how does that, where does that fit into the other areas that we've talked about in terms of what's going on. Then you have Immanuel Kant, who is one of the few philosophers to actually live and see the French Revolution. He's one of the great thinkers of the time. He has enormous influence on philosophy today. He wrote things like Metaphysics and the Nature of Reality. He wrote epistemology, and he wrote on morality and all these things. He talks about, and I gave you one of the other PSAs from him, really an interesting read. It's very deep. Like, it's pretty heavy. Like, very heavy. Like, it's tough to understand what he's talking about, but if you can get a grasp on it, it's profound. Like, really profound. He's also famous for his kind of classic phrase, dare to know, and saying that, that enlightenment was an act of personal courage. And I think it's really great, too. I think that acquiring knowledge is a bold thing. Knowledge can actually change your presuppositions and help you make tough choices, and I think that we should embrace that. And dare to know is a pretty neat way to kind of put that. And what he said about morality, and then you can read the article, is really interesting. He said the sole feature that gives an action moral worth is not the outcome achieved by the action, but the motive behind it. And the only motive that can endow an act with moral value, is that motive is the only thing that can endow an act with moral value. In other words, like for it to be morally virtuous, it has to come from the inside. An act itself cannot be morally virtuous. Donating to charity by itself is not morally virtuous.
It's the act or the thought behind it.
It's the inward perspective of why you're doing that makes something morally right or wrong. Now, you could apply that to almost anything.
But then it's like,
People say some curse words are immoral. But what is the intention behind those words for the person saying them? Does that instantly mean that words are immoral or that actions are immoral if you don't mean them to be? And then you could take that and turn it into the negative, like where, you can take it to the extreme, I guess, where it's like, the Nazis didn't think it was immoral to murder the Jews. So was it immoral in their eyes?
but see, then there's like
It's tough.
It's not black and white all the way.
Correct.
Because like some actions can have bad outcomes, but then even if you had a morally good intent, it has a bad outcome, so therefore, it's
Right. And so it's kind of an interesting way to kind of look at some of this stuff, What do the rulers do with these movements as they become more popular? The middle class grows. The middle class endorses a lot of these ideas. What is a savvy ruler going to do? Well, you're going to have to stamp it out, or it's going to become too late and it's going to spread. And so many of them will actually present themselves as enlightened, and you can kind of say it's like enlightened despotism. They're asking people for real political reform. Can a king actually reform the society and keep his authority and then still be enlightened in all these other ways? Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, Joseph II. These are all individuals who are trying to do this here, and they're going to expand education, increase religious tolerance, and do all these things that the Enlightenment wants them to do, but they're also going to try and stay in power. And is it true reform, or is it cynical, manipulative consolidation of power, right? Are we using these new ideas and faking belief in them in order to just find a new way to justify their rule? And so, do you have to care about the middle class? And I think as long as you say, hey, these people have rights and all of that, that's what really is going to determine how these people are thought of in history. The other Enlightenment thinkers, like in America, would say, no, a king is a tyrant, always will be, their son will eventually be, or something, and that kings can't rule enlightened civilizations. But you have other people who disagree, and they try and do this, and try and stay in power. And oftentimes that leads to the overthrow of those kings and queens, like the French Revolution, which we will eventually get to. But all of that finds its roots here in the Enlightenment. And that brings us to an end of our lecture.